All right. Welcome back. So we are in 2019. And what had happened was in Pennsylvania, if you had a PFA against you, so there had been physical evidence that you had abused your partner, um, you went through court, there was due process, you have a protection order against you. You have to turn your guns in, but you have 60 days to do so, and you can turn them into a friend or a family member, any third party. And so we saw an increase in recent history of homicides by firearms. We actually found out that in regards to firearms, 1/5 of homicide victims with PFA orders in place were murdered within 2 days of obtaining that protection order. And 1/3 were murdered within 1 month, so within 30 days. 60 days to turn in the weapon was quite frankly not long enough, and they didn't think that handing it to a third party was safe enough. So come 2019, you must seize your weapons within 24 hours to law enforcement. Woo! I love that one. So that is a social and political timeline of this issue. Now let's talk about some local, state, and national services and agencies and organizations that work to help, amend this issue, eradicate this issue. So first, local agencies like the Domestic Violence Center of Chester County, where I live. There is a local domestic violence center in Delaware County, I believe where Widener is located. It's DAP, the Domestic Abuse Project. But I decided to do Domestic Violence Center of Chester County. They provide tons of direct services to victim survivors of domestic violence. So they have a 24-hour hotline. They have a crisis emergency shelter for survivors. They have transitional housing options, like multiple transitional housing options. They provide individual counseling. They have a therapist who is a trauma certified therapist. They also have group counseling, and in the group counseling, they do educational programming, everything from like self-defense to nutrition to budgeting. It's really, really awesome and educational. They have children's counseling and children's advocacy programs, individual children's counseling, and then also group counseling with that similar educational thing to it. So they have music therapy groups, they have art group, they have yoga group, they have a literary exploration with a local library program that comes in. So the children's counseling is really comprehensive, quite frankly. They have legal advocacy programs. They provide legal representation. They also provide court accompaniment. And then they also have local education and prevention programming in place to help prevent this issue. And I'm going to talk about a couple of their community prevention programs when we're talking about interventions. So state coalitions like the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So on the state level, here is an organization that's fighting domestic violence. What PCADV's role really is to oversee the, I think, 59 or 60 local coalitions like Domestic Violence Center of Chester County. And what PCADV is, they oversee and support and provide resources and training for those staff, for those local organizations. And then they also receive the state funding, and then they disperse the funding throughout those organizations via grants. And then they also engage in a ton of state legislative advocacy, which is really important, getting policy change in place. So the national version of PCADV, so essentially doing a similar role to PCADV, is NCADV, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They don't oversee, I don't believe, the state coalitions. However, they do provide education, a national conference every year for all the state and local organizations. They provide training online. webinars. They also engage in such amazing federal legislative advocacy and provide so many awesome online resources and tools. Another really great national service is funded through government grant funding, and it's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. This hotline is fantastic. You can call it, and what they do is they connect you with services that are as local as possible to you at any given time. So I love the National Domestic Violence Hotline when talking about services and programs in place to help victims, survivors of domestic violence. So let's get into some interventions. I'm really excited to talk about interventions. So since the class is about child welfare, I really decided for the micro level intervention to focus on the children. So I like using child-centered play therapy. So it's an amazing approach for working directly with the child witnesses of domestic violence. So materials and toys in child-centered play therapy are used to either directly or symbolically act out their emotions, their thoughts, or even the experiences that occurred. And it can be really cathartic for children. As I wrote here, their primary language is play. And play is a way for them to safely process traumas like domestic violence. It can also help them play with fantasy scenarios, which I learned about, which is really cool, wherein they become the rescuer, or they have a nurturing parent, or they get revenge, unfortunately, or fortunately. These fantasy scenarios that they create can be really empowering and can help them develop a positive self-concept, which in a study I read about CCPT, is cited as a protective factor for children in domestic violence situations, positive self-concept. However, the real cool thing about this is that rather than focusing on specific methods and techniques, they really focused more on the relationship with the worker and just free play. So the role of the worker is primary. The relationship is so important. It can assist in the healing even more than the play itself. So first, being a consistent, predictable adult who is allowing a child to feel safe and who is modeling healthy relationship and communication behaviors will help that child flourish. But first, the child is going to have to trust you. And so it's important to note that in domestic violence situations, this may take time due to their history with adults. So best practices for workers that were outlined in the article that I read, to reflect the children's play behavior, to reflect the children's feelings back, to facilitate decision-making scenarios in play for them, to encourage them, so help them build self-esteem, positively encourage them. Limit setting, so helping show them how to positively set limits and to set boundaries in their own lives. If a child is delving too far into like a negative, repetitive reliving of trauma via play, they suggest to utilize a softer and slower tone to help the child focus again on the present sense of safety, as well as using encouraging words to help them move past the trauma in that moment. You know, you're working really hard to figure this out, things like that. So let's talk about community interventions. So first, I read a study that reviewed over 20 community interventions for domestic violence, and then in reviewing them, I took it upon myself to compare them to the CDC's list of best practices and focus areas for intimate partner violence prevention programming. So a lot of the 20 community interventions were group counseling ideas and coordinated community responses. So partnerships and referrals and communications between different systems is an example of some of the programs. So, communication between law enforcement and domestic violence centers through TANF services and welfare and domestic violence services. Some of the programs were primary education programs. So they helped with like a financial and career focus, or there were parenting classes. Some of them were yoga classes, so helpful for trauma. Some of them had a more cultural focus. Some of them had to do with personal empowerment or even legislative empowerment, which is cool. A lot of them involved safety planning and taking control of, and ownership over their safety. Um, some of them provided leadership opportunities and peer advocacy empowerment opportunities, which was pretty cool. One of them was a horticultural group um, community intervention, which I think was cool. Um, well, we'll talk about that. So, um, I just thought it was cool because what it did is that it provided them the ability to cultivate and clean up the neighborhood while also planting and growing flowers, which is a really therapeutic experience in itself. Um, so the CDC recommends that programs for domestic violence community intervention teach safe and healthy relationship skills, that they engage influential adults and peers through bystander empowerment programs, for example, that they disrupt the developmental pathways toward partner violence, like parenting skill building programs or engaging with the family in multiple levels of service, that they create protective environments by improving school safety, by improving physical and social environments of the neighborhood. So that's that horticultural therapy program. That they strengthen the economic supports for families. So financial programming, like the financial group that was discussed in that lit review. And that they also support survivors to increase their own safety and lessen harm. So helping them through safety education, but also through helping them with legal programming and housing programming, which is awesome. So I'm going to review two different evidence-based programs in regards to community and to these CDC recommendations. But first, I'm almost out of time. I'm going to be that annoying person who has 3 videos. I just am very passionate about this cause. So I appreciate you guys bearing with me. So I'm going to take a pause here. See you in a moment.